So first and foremost, today's broadcast is dedicated by Pesach Adel, Leila Nishmas. His mother, whose Yortzeit is on Thursday, which is tomorrow, and her name is Ya'nטע, Preidah, Baliמא, Rafael, Abraham, Neshama Shel Aliyah, and the Yortzeit is Gimel Kyslev, which is tomorrow. Today is Beis Kislev, and today is the Yortzeit of Baron Kotler. Baron Kotler is one of the people who is responsible for at least Torah, if not Yiddishkeit, in America. And the other famous Yortzeit today, interesting enough, is the Mashgiach of Lakewood, of Nosson Wachtweigel. Nosson Wachtweigel has a Canadian connection, because when he was about 15 years old, his parents immigrated to Montreal. His father took a position in Montreal. And lucky for him, he took on Canadian citizenship. And as an older teenager, he ended up moving to Europe, and he learned in the different yeshivas in Europe, and he was there by the Holocaust. And he was able to get out with his family only because of his Canadian citizenship. So Nosson Wachtweigel and his family were saved due to their Canadian citizenship. The proud Canadian. That's number one. And Baron Kotler, there's so many stories about him, but Baron Kotler was one of the most active members of the Vat Hatzalah. He escaped during the war. He actually went through Japan. And he came to America. He was a real fighter to save, and at that point, it was the Hungarian Yidden at the end of the war. So he fought, and there's a story, there's a book that's officially written about a Yid by the name of Eruvin, who was the president of Young Israel. He was a very chashuv Yid. He was a president of Young Israel during the war years. And he was very, very close to Rabbi Aaron at all times. He was Rabbi Aaron's right-hand man. And the book about Eruvin Bunim, it's called A Fire in the Soul, is really a book about Rabbi Aaron Kotler, because they were inseparable. So I read the book. It's an incredible, incredible book. So first of all, we look at Young Israel, Young Israel is ultimately what saved Orthodoxy in the United States. There would not be any Orthodoxy in the United States if it wasn't for Young Israel. That they were what Orthodox Judaism was, and they were the ones who pioneered it. The way it always works is someone pioneers it, and then everybody else comes and says, "Oh, you're not firm enough, and move more to the right." But they don't realize that's even how Toronto started. Time started. Also, he said, "Oh, it's too much to go to the right." But someone's got to start somewhere. No matter what you start, where you start, someone's always going to come out and say you're tonight and move more to the right. But someone's got to get the ball rolling. So Young Israel really gets credit for Yiddishkeit in America. So the two unbelievable stories were Rabbi Aaron Kotler was pushing that money should be sent to bail out Eden. And this group of Eden in particular that they were pushing for were non-from Eden. So the joint or whichever committee that was controlled by the non-fruma told Rabbi Aaron, why do you care to rescue them? They're not even Orthodox. So Abraham freaked out. He says, they're not Orthodox. They're just as Jewish as I am. Every molecule in their body is just as Jewish as me. They're just as Jewish. And if you don't send the money or do whatever you need to do to save these Eden, what I'm going to do is I'm going to vandalize your storefront, because they operate out of storefront. I'm going to throw a rock through. I'm going to get arrested, and I'm going to tell everybody the reason why I did it is because you don't want to save non-Orthodox Jews, and you're discriminating against non-Orthodox Jews. And I'll get into the papers because I'll be arrested. So they backed down. The biggest one of the biggest things that Rabbi Kotler did is at the end of the war, they needed to transfer money to Europe, which was illegal during war years, to save a lot of Eden. And they needed to get the Secretary of State to sign off. I believe that was Henry Morgenthau, or was he the Secretary of the Treasury? They needed Henry Morgenthau, who was a non-from Eden. They needed him to sign off on it. And he didn't want to because it would jeopardize his whole political career. It was illegal during war years to transfer money to enemy territory. So Rabbi went to Washington with Eruvin Bunim. And Eruvin Bunim was Rabbi's translator. Rabbi did not speak English. And he was sitting there in a meeting, and he told Henry Morgenthau, of course, Eruvin Bunim was a translator, that we need to transfer this money. So Henry Morgenthau said, I'm really sorry, I'm not able to do that, because it will jeopardize my whole career, my whole position, my whole life. So So Eruvin Bunim translated that to Rabbi, and it didn't need much translation. You could tell from a person's features, his facial features, what his response is. And Rabbi went ballistic. And in his rapid fire Yiddish, he says, "Sogim, as ein ganze Panosche, unser ganze Position, unser ganze government, unser ganze Autokollenschwert gegen the Leben von den Yid." He was like freaking out. So Henry Morgenthau turned to Eruvin and says, what is the rabbi saying? So, and Eruvin writes that Rabbi often put me into very difficult positions where I had to translate what he said. So he said the rabbi is very disappointed and very upset that you're not willing to permit the transfer of funds. So Barnes says, "Das ist nicht, was ich habe gesagt. Das ist ein Punkt, was ich habe gesagt." So Kirby got to say word for word exactly what he said, and he started to cry. Henry Morgan started to cry, and he says, "You're right," and he signed off on it, even though it would jeopardize everything he ever was, and he did sign off on it. So that was one famous match with the Baron, and the other famous match with the Baron is they were traveling on a Tinus. They were traveling on a Tinus from New York to Washington to meet some official also regarding war efforts. And the Baron turned to Eruvin and said, "You need to eat." He said, "That's a fast day, I can't eat." He says, "Yeah, but you need to be in fine form, in perfect form. You're making a presentation in front of a government official. You must eat because you must be healthy." And Eruvin said, "No, I'm perfectly fine. I'm not going to eat." After the meeting, they're all exhausted and such a relief. You finally go through you made your presentation. They're back on the train on the way back. Eruvin says, "I'm starved. I think I'm going to have something to eat." So Rabbi said, "Nein, yes, Tosh Shanish Essen. I only said I eat, so your performance should be good. Now you'll just have to suck it up." Those are two of the stories that I remember from the book. There are probably other stories that were good, but I remember those. Okay, and the Shema Hallelujah. And then Rav Bachlevel was known to have a suit prepared at all times to greet Mashiach. He lived with Mashiach, and they even say a guy was once practicing blowing shofar one night, and you see Rav Nosson running out with his suitcase and his that was packed and his kapata ready to go. And they say it started. I don't even know if I should say this on the recording. There was a very sad history in Lakewood. Years ago in the 60s, they had a terrible suicide. It was a terrible suicide in Lakewood because you have a young man who has no way to make pranasa, and he's getting so many programs that he can no longer leave. He can no longer leave because his income will drop so much by getting a job that comes with no qualifications, with no skills. He simply can't afford to leave Koil. And there were people that were boxed in like that, and that led to a suicide. And after that, Schneer was very big into pushing people out of Lakewood and getting them jobs. So there's a guy who's a young man. When I came to yeshiva at 20, he was like 65 years old. He was still a young man in Koil. So I asked him, "How did you get through that?" So he tells me, "Well, the Mashgiach calls me in. The Mashgiach calls me in and says, 'Yankel,' whatever his name was, ich hab 5 Hasteller. He says, "Really gewaltig. Was 5 Hasteller das? Da mag ich hier." He says, "Nein, ich habe 5 Hasteller als Mashgiach." He says, "Als Mashgiach, gewaltig. In welche yeshiva?" So he says, "To not yeshiva." Yeah. So I told the Mashiach, "Don't worry, I won't kill myself." And he walked out. And the Nosson never came after him after that. But there was such a movement. It was a good movement because you needed to give you that hope, and they needed to move on, right? There was no one pushing them to move on, so Rav Nosson did that. I'll call Israel. Okay. We are up to the Mishnah and Daf Kuf Aleph Amud Aleph. Lo Yamid Adam Rishus HaYachid Yiftach Rishus HaRabim. You shouldn't stand in Rishus HaYachid and stick your hand out the window and pick up a key in Rishus HaRabim and put it into a lock that's in Rishus HaRabim to open the door. So you're physically standing in Rishus HaYachid. You're moving a chayfetz from Rishus HaRabim to Rishus HaRabim. No isser being done there within Dalet Amos. You shouldn't do that. Why shouldn't you do that? Because we're afraid you're going to bring that key that you're holding into your hand to you, and then you've transferred it from a Rishus HaRabim to Rishus HaYachid. So we learned a Mishnah a couple of days ago that you're not worried if someone's leaning over into another Rishus that someone might move it. We learned you're allowed to move something in a Rishus HaRabim if you're standing in a Rishus HaYachid, or vice versa. So if you remember, the Gemara said there's a Reb Meir who argues on this. And there's Reb Meir who is concerned that you might bring it into your Rishus. And this is that Reb Meir. Our Rabbanon, in our Mishnah a couple of days ago, held that you don't have to be choshed, that if you're in Rishus HaYachid and you're handling items in Rosh Hashanah, you don't have to be concerned to pull them to you, unless it's kelim chashuvim, such as water. It was only by water where the Mishnah said you have to be rosh v'ruboy in the place where the water is. But otherwise, if it's just items, you can stick your hand out and move things around. That would not be a problem. But Reb Meir does argue. So layamid adam b'shus hayachid the yiftach b'shus harabim, or b'shus harabim v'yiftach b'shus hayachid. Ella imkein asa mechitza gavaya asar tvachim. So Rashi learns that if you're standing in the Rishus Harabim and you want to move things in the Rishus HaYachid, and Rashi gives you an example of how that would work. Once something is above 10 Tvachim from the ground in the Rishus Harabim, that's already called Rishus HaYachid. So if you for instance you want to open up a lock to a door and the keyhole is up high above 10 Tvachim, so you're allowed to take a key. Let's say there's a ledge there that's part of the Rishus HaYachid. You take the key off the ledge, that's technically Rishus HaYachid, you turn it into the lock, and you open the door that way, right? So that's you standing in Rishus Harabim manipulating something that's in Rishus HaYachid. You're allowed to do that. However, you're not allowed to do that. However, Zok Reb Meir, if you build a wall around you, so you take a barrier that's this shape and wrap it around you, so now you made yourself a little Rishus HaYachid that's adjacent to the wall that you're working on. So you have a wall in front of you that's considered the Rishus HaYachid. You're standing in Rishus HaYachid. Put a barrier around you, so you've basically increased the Rishus HaYachid to include you. Now you're in the Rishus HaYachid. The key that you want to move in the Rishus HaYachid, the place you're moving the key to is Rishus HaYachid. It's all Rishus HaYachid, so there's no concern.
Which Rameir is concerned? You might move it.
If I'm in Rishus Harabim, I might take the key and pull it to me, and it's such a slight, easy movement, right? Even if I have to scratch my head and I'm holding the key, I can just go like this, and that would lead someone to move something from our Rishus to that Rishus.
Build this wall on Shabbos.
It doesn't say you can build it on Shabbos. It says if you had one prepared before Shabbos, then you could do it. In other words, no. In other words, no. That's right. Right, exactly. Then it's not a Rishus Harabim anymore because you've created your mini Rishus HaYachid.
It never was to begin with. It was there before Shabbos, and that's where you're standing. Right?
I hear. But it's still outside. Just a Amr Loi, so they responded to Rameir and said this is not required. Ma'aseh b'shuk shel petamim shehayu b'Yerushalayim. There was the butcher shuk. Shal Yunoyelin, they would lock the door from the outside. So the window on top of the door was a Rishus HaYachid. The door is a Rishus HaYachid. They would be in the Rishus Harabim, and they would lean. Well, we're soon going to see this. They weren't in Rishus Harabim, it was a Carmelist, but let's say it was a Sharabim or a Carmelist. They would lean into the Rishus HaYachid, take the key, unlock it, and then put the key back. So you see it's allowed. So the Chacham are bringing a riot to Rameir that this was allowed. If Yosy Yomer Shuk Shel Tzamarim Hava, it wasn't the butcher area; it was the fabric area. So it's just a shaila about accuracy where it was. There are those who learn that it makes a difference because Shuk Shel Batamim is something where people go much more frequently than when they buy fabric, and therefore it's a bigger riot. Okay. So this is what the Gemara talks about. So let's just think for a second. I was trying to create to visualize this. The store, a lot of stores, their key to open the door. I'm imagining like in Brooklyn, where at the end of the day, everyone rolls down that steel awning, right? So sometimes the key is at the bottom where you have your padlock, but sometimes the key is all the way at the top. So depending on where the key is, if the key was at the bottom, then it's in Rishus Harabim. If the key was on top, then it's in Rishus HaYachid, right? It's above 10 Tvachim. So we're going to discuss the different places of where the keys were and how to deal with it. But the bottom.
Why are they going into the store on Shabbos?
Well, I have another problem. After you learn this Mishnah, you have a serious security breach because not everyone knows who he is.
That's right.
I was wondering that.
That was going to be my next question.
And you think about it, it's unbelievable. Who would have ever thought that someone might leave the key on top of the ledge? I never heard of anyone ever doing that in my life. So we think Tanai is actually leave the key on top of the ledge. They've known it for a long time. So I'm not sure how that works.
Yosy, it doesn't have to be also an area 4x4 if we're talking.
Yes, it does. So when we're talking about it being on the window, the Gemara is going to speak out that the window ledge has to be 4x4. Otherwise, it's a Mokum Ptur. Now, if
Right.
it's a Mokum Ptur, it's even better. You're for sure allowed to take something from a Mokum Ptur and put it into the Rosh Hashanah.
Uh-huh.
So
All right.
that wouldn't be a problem. Okay. So Zak the Gemara. The Gemara is going to discuss soon where you took the key from, where you put it when you were done, and we're gonna address that issue. So Zak the Hela the Gemara. For Rabbanon, let's see what the Rabbanon are talking about over here. Omer Reb Meir Rosh Hashanah. Reb Meir was speaking about Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, a real deraisa. And Reb Meir said that even that from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah and vice versa, you're not allowed to move things. You're not allowed to move things unless you have a barrier. So you're making yourself part of the Rosh Hashanah. And they're bringing a raya that would be allowed. Imagine the Carmelis. Carmelis is a Rabbanon. So how could you bring a raya from a case of a Rabbanon where it was allowed to a real deraisa, where a mayor holds it's not allowed? Yerushalayim, the city of Yerushalayim, and we had this before. If its doors were not closed every night, it would be considered a Rosh Hashanah. But now that there's doors, it's like a Carmelis. So you see, Yerushalayim has the status of a Carmelis. Maybe only there was this system allowed by the Shuk Shal Patamim or the Shuk Shal Tamar. But who said the same thing would be allowed in a Rosh Hashanah? Amar Papa, kan kodim shenifritzu ba pratzais. When do we say that that Yerushalayim was not a Rosh Hashanah? That's before there was a tax on the city and things broke, walls broke and doors broke. But after Yerushalayim was somewhat charav, then it's wide open, and now it's Rosh Hashanah. So in fact, the story in Yerushalayim is referring to something that has a halachic status of Rosh Hashanah. Kanach shenifritzu pratzais. Rav Amar Seifa also Nashari Gida. There was actually an additional case that Rav Meir addressed that we don't see in our Mishnah. In addition to the case of our Mishnah, which is a question of being in a Rosh Hashanah and manipulating things in a Rosh Hashanah and vice versa, the Mishnah also discusses issues with the Carmelis, where Rav Meir is Machmer, and on that, the Rabbanim brought a raya from the story of Yerushalayim, which was a Carmelis. So there's a couple of things I want to take care of. First of all, we have to ask a question over here. We have to ask a question over here. Yerushalayim had doors, so the question is: in order to enclose a Rosh Hashanah, does it have to be doors, or could they have any other things blocking it? So there's a machlokes rishonim if to enclose a big area you actually need doors that open and close, or if it could just be plywood or whatever. But the other thing that's interesting is in Yerushalayim, it was a Carmelis. Why was it a Carmelis? Because it's no longer technically a Rosh Hashanah because it's enclosed. So why didn't they make an Erev Chatzeres and then you can carry Yerushalayim? Why didn't they ever do that? So the Poish can bring a raya from here that you're not supposed to. The Poish can bring a raya from here that you're not supposed to make an Erev in a whole big city. And Rabbeinu Ephraim even holds you're not even supposed to enclose a whole big city. So the Poskim have a discussion. I know Rav Moshe held that you weren't allowed to make an Erev around the whole Manhattan, because most of the Poskim bring rise from here that you're not supposed to make an Erev around the entire city.
They didn't do it in Yerushalayim?
I'm sorry?
And the fact that they didn't
do it in Yerushalayim, because otherwise they should have just made an Erev. The fact that they didn't shows you that you can make an Eruvin in neighborhoods, which is a Moshe Paskin. You can make a neighborhood Eruvin, but you can't make the whole city. As a matter of fact, the exception to that rule is Toronto, because our Toronto, it was basically the whole city, the whole Jewish city of Toronto was enclosed by the Erev of Grabert. And the Poskim said that Rav Moshe only paskined in New York area that you're not allowed to make an Erev around the whole Manhattan, which is what some people tried to do. He paskined it after our Erev was here already. So Toronto is the only Erev that predates Rav Moshe's Psak. I believe it went to Rabbi Yashiv. I believe there was this shayla that went to Rabbi Yashiv, and we had it a long time ago. Rabbi Yashiv said even though Rabbi Moshe paskined that way, that Psak was after our Erev was already established. So if you want to have an opportunity to be able to have a big citywide Erev, you have to move to Toronto. Only in Canada. Just like Tetley Tea. Only in Canada. Zok the Helig Gemor Viter. Rav Amar Sefer Asan l'Sharagina. It's referring to the gates of a garden, which is a Carmelist. V'achik Amar. Not only should you not stand in Rosh Hashanah and manipulate things with Rosh Hashanah and vice versa, but layamid Rosh Hashanah v'yiftach b'Carmelist or b'Carmelist v'yiftach Rosh Hashanah. Don't stand in the Rosh Hashanah and move things around in the Carmelist, and don't stand in the Carmelist and move things around in the Rosh Hashanah, unless you have a mechitza or a mayor said, and then on that Acham said, we have rayas from the Carmelists of Yerushalayim, where in fact that was allowed. So let's turn over the Ella, imkain also mechitza gavoya asara. Unless you made a mechitza gavoya asara, tvachim devar mayor, and the Amrullah, Ma'is B'Shul Shal P'tamim, Shal Yerushalayim, Shal Yinoylin, Amonichin, and Samftech B'Chaloin, Shal Gabay Pesach, and the B'Yitzhi Omer, Shuk Shal Tzamar Moya. So now we're going to elaborate on how this all works. You have the doorway that goes into a garden. So you're going into the garden from, let's say, a Rosh Hashanah. So you have a gate that's in between the Rosh Hashanah and the Gina, which is a Carmelist. Sometimes the doorway isn't just a door and a fence. Sometimes there's a structure built that the door opens into. It's called a Beishar. There's a little booth at the entrance, like a guard tower, or like a vestibule. That's right, but it's not part of a house. It's a standalone building. So b'zman sheyesh lahem beishar mibefnim, paisech v'noel mibefnim. Then you could stand in this beishar, which is a Rosh Hashanah, and you could open and close the door. You could move the key around, because when you're in the beishar, you're only moving things in a Rosh Hashanah. Mibechutz. What if the beishar was sticking out into the Rosh Hashanah? So before you hit the gate that gets into the Gina, there was a little booth. So then, because again, when you're inside that Beishar, you're in the Rosh Hashanah, and you're only moving something around in the Rosh Hashanah. Mikan and mikan. What if there was a little booth in front of the entrance on the outside, as well as in front of the entrance on the inside? So then, then you could open this gate and you can move the key around on either side, because on either side of this gate is a Rosh Hashanah. What about ein lahem loy lekan v'loy lekan? What if it's just a gate and a fence with absolutely nothing in front of it at all? So then asur and kan v'kan. Now you're not allowed to stand in the Rosh Hashanah and move things around in the Carmelists or vice versa. V'chein chanuyos. So this, of course, is with the shita of Rameir, because according to the Rabbanim, this would not be a problem. V'chein chanuyos hapsuches l'Rosh Hashanah. The same thing would be if you had stores that were open to the Rosh Hashanah, and the Gemara is going to explain that the area directly in front of the chanus the threshold is considered a Carmelist. What if the key is low on the floor? So what you do is maybe maftayach me'erev Shabbos u'manicha be'eskupa. You'll take the key on Erev Shabbos and you'll put it on the eskupa, which has a din of Carmelist. And the lock that's low down is also considered Carmelist. Tomorrow you're allowed to open the store and close the store, and with the key that you take off the eskupa, and you'll put the key back when you're done opening the lock. You put it back on the eskupa because you're manipulating something that's only in the Carmelist. And according to Meir, you would have to be standing on top of that eskupa while you do it, because you have to be in the same rishus as the thing that we're allowing you to move. What if the key of the lock was above 10, meaning you're standing on the eskupa in a Carmelist, yet the lock is up on top in a Rosh Hashanah? So then you have to do it a little differently. Maybe mafteach me'erev Shabbos, you bring a key from Erev Shabbos, umanicha b'mina, you leave it on the lock. The lock, it was a big lock, you were able to put a key on it. Rashi tells us in those days that big locks. L'machar paisech v'noel. So tomorrow you're standing in the Carmelist, you could take the key which is on the lock, which is a Rosh Hashanah, and you could unlock the lock, which is also in Rosh Hashanah, umachzir l'mkoymai, and you could put it back on the lock. Divrei Meir. I'm not sure. But what we just learned now was a departure from what Reb Meir said until now. Until now, Reb Meir said that if you're in a Carmelist, you're not allowed to manipulate something in a Rosh Hashanah. Or if you're in a Rosh Hashanah, you're not allowed to manipulate something that's in a Carmelist. But with this Brisa, with this case that we just learned, Reb Meir is Choizer, and Reb Meir holds that if you were in a Carmelist, you would be able to manipulate the key and the lock that was in Rosh Hashanah, and vice versa. The Gemara is going to soon tell us that this lock was a Mokum Dalet al Dalet, and it's actually Rosh Hashanah. The Gemara is actually going to address it directly. And so I was a little bit premature in announcing that this is a right that Reb Meir was Chayzer, because the Gemara hadn't yet said that it's a Mokum Dalet Dalet. So that's a good catch. The only reason why I threw it out early is because Rashi did also. The Chachamim and the Chacham said, Af bisman shamino l'mala me'asar t'vachim. Even if the lock is above 10 tvachim, maybe mafteach me'erev Shabbos. You can bring a keep me'erev Shabbos, and you don't have to put it on top of the lock in Rosh Hashanah. Umanicha b'askupa. You can leave it on the askupa, which will be a carmelist. And lemachar tomorrow, paiseach v'noyel. He could take the key from the carmelist, open up the lock, which apparently is a Rosh Hashanah, which is we're going to have to deal with because nobody holds that. Umachzir them koymein, then you can put it back on the askupa, or you can put it on a window ledge, shal gavay pesach, that's on top of the door. Then the Chacham go, im yesh b'chaloin arba al arba, but if the window is 4x4, which means it's Rosh Hashanah, then it's going to be aser, because then you're transferring something from a Carmelist into a Rosh Hashanah. So the Gemara is going to drill down and analyze this price. This case of the Chanuyos, since when the Brisa introduced the case of the stores, it said v'chein, it would indicate that it's a similar case to the case that we've been discussing earlier with Sharagina, that was always only a shayla of a Carmelist. There's no Rishus HaYachid to the Rishus HaRabim transfer involved at all. It's only a question of Carmelist to Rishus HaYachid. So mitik Amar v'chein Chanuyos machlal de be'eskubas Carmelist haskina. The eskuba in front of this store is a Carmelist. So let's think about this. Hi mino heichidami. This lock, where Mary said you can leave the key on top of the lock, what is the case? Either less by arba, makam tur. If there's no arba, it's a makam tur. And if that's the case, why do I have to leave the key there? I can leave it in the Carmelist. I can transfer it to a makam tur and back. There's no problem transferring something on Shabbos from a Carmelist to a makam tur. So why would your mayor say that you have to leave the key up there on Shabbos? The isbe arba, and if we're talking about a lock that is arba, meaning it's now a Rishus HaYachid, and that's where Meir said that you have to leave the key there because you wouldn't be able to transfer it there from the Carmelist on Shabbos. Maybe Maftech Meir of Shabbos or Manicha Baskufa. What did the Chum say? On Friday, you can take the key, put it in the skufa, which is a Carmelist, and Lamachar tomorrow, Pesach Fanoil, you could open the door. How could you do that? You're moving it from a Carmelist to a Rosh Hashanah. Nobody holds that you're allowed to do that. So to Gemara Amar Abaye, so the case of the Brisa is la'olam de'ein b'arba. You have to say that this door, this lock, is a place that in and of itself, it's not a makam dalet al dalet. So it would be a makam tur. But v'yesh boy lachuk ulashlim al dalet. But you could open up more and make it dalet. So we need to understand, we're talking about a lock. So when I think of a lock, I think of a padlock. How can I make a padlock bigger? It doesn't make any sense. But if you look at the picture in the art scroll, the way he perceives a lock is he looks at the lock that it's like a bolt that sticks into the door. You could see he has a picture of a crevice cut out of the doorway, but it also extends out of the doorway. So since if you have this bolt that's mounted on the doorway, but the door itself is thick, and you'd be able to carve out the door and make the place where the lock is have a bigger surface, so then you might be able to, technically, if you wanted to actually cut out the door, you would create for yourself a larger surface. So in this case, the crevice cut out in the door itself was not there. You only had that bolt mounted on the outside of the door. But technically, the top surface you could increase in size by chiseling out part of the wood from the door. You can always chisel out the door, but is the door thick enough that with the space inside the door, you'll have a mukam dalet al dalet? It would have to be a pretty thick door. So that was the case over here. So there is no mukam dalet al dalet on the lock, but you can technically carve out the door to create a larger surface, even though you didn't actually do that.
In theory, you don't
That's right.
Theoretically.
Theoretically, you could do that. You have the space to do that. And this is a shaila we've had many times. So, but there's thickness in the door that if you chisel out, you'll be able to create a surface that dalad al dalad. And this is the machlokes. Since theoretically I could carve the door out and create that space, it has the status of a reshus hayachid, and therefore I cannot move anything from a carmelist to that area. You don't make believe that it's a 4x4 area. So according to the Rabbanan, this area on top of the lock would be a mukkam tour, and therefore you're allowed to transfer from the carmelist to that mukkam tour. But according to Reb Meir, this has a status of a reshus hayachid, and therefore you may not transfer there. Now this Shiloh Chok in Lahashim we had many times, and the original case where it was introduced is if you have an arch doorway and you don't have enough side wall to put your mezuzah up. Do you say Chok in Lahashim, since you can carve the round part of the doorway out and create a rectangular doorway, if there's room in the wall to do that, then it would need a mezuzah. But if there's no wall, it's just an arch, if you cut that out, there'd be nothing left, then you don't say Chok in Lahashim, and then you wouldn't be able to have a mezuzah there. So there's a machlokes Reb Meir and the Chachamim. If there's a full wall that has an arch doorway in it, do you cut it out? Do you cut it open to make it a completely horizontal doorway? We had the shaila lagabe if it would be a pesach in between two chatzeres. With the same shaila, if you say Chok in Lahashim, it would be a complete doorway. If not, no. In our case, the Chok in Lahashim makes it into a surface of dalad al dalad, which would make it into a reshus hayachid, which according to Reb Meir it is, and therefore you cannot transfer from the carmelist to reshus hayachid. According to Chachamim, since it remains as a small area, you don't take Chok in Lahashim, so therefore it's only a makom torah, and therefore you'd be allowed to take something from the carmelist and put it onto the makom torah. So now we're going to see how all the dust settles from this machlokes. Amar Rabbi Barbai, Shmamina, from the analysis that we just made of the machlokes of Meir and the Rabbanon, Shmamina mehamas tisatlas. We can extract three important pieces of information. Shmamina Chok in Lahashim. At least from our Meir, you see he holds Chok in Lahashim, and that's why he holds that you cannot put your key on the askupa Erev Shabbos and just transfer it to the lock on Shabbos. Rather, you have to leave it on top of the lock on Shabbos, because otherwise you're transferring something from a carmelist to a reshus hayachid. Ushmamina hodabar Reb Meir misharigina. We also see that Reb Meir was chozer, and Reb Meir holds that you're allowed to stand in a carmelist and move things around in a reshus hayachid, which is unlike what he said in our Mishnah. Ushmas mina. The next thing we learn from here is that the Rabbanan hold of Rav Dimi. So let's think about this. What did the Rabbanan say? The Rabbanan said, let's go back to their case so we have clarity. So the Chachamim say as follows. The middle is above 10 tefachim, and remember the Chachamim consider this to be a makom tur, because they say ein Chok in Lahashim. So what you can do is maybe mafteach ma'erev Shabbos. You take a key from Erev Shabbos, umanich b'askupa. You put it in the carmelist. L'macher paseich v'noil, because you're transferring the key from a carmelist to a makom tur. There's no problem with that. But you put it back on the askupa. Or you could put it to a windowsill near the lock, but that's only if it's not a makom dalad al dalad. But if the windowsill is a makom dalad al dalad, you couldn't. So let's think about it. Why not? I picked it up for the carmelist, and I transferred it to a makom tur. That's 100% allowed, right? Now I open the lock. Why can I take the lock out of the makom tur and put it into reshus hayachid? Why can't I do that? The teretz is because of Rav Dimi's halacha. Rav Dimi says you're not allowed to use a makom tur as an Indian reservation. And you see from the Chachamim, Shmami Nami the Rabbanon, Isa Rav Dimi, that you're not allowed to use a makom tur to transport things from a carmelist to reshus hayachid. So since this key started off in the carmelist, it started off on the doorpost, on the threshold, you're not, even though you open the lock with it and the lock was a makom tur, you have to put it back where it came from. You cannot now transfer it in to a reshus hayachid. The Chiyas Rav Dimi Omar B'Yochanan, we had this many times. Makom she'ein bo yavar al bo mutar levnei reshus harabim u'levnei reshus hayachid nekatif alav. You're allowed to move things from the reshus harabim into the makom tur, from the reshus hayachid into the makom tur, u'vavach shlo yichlifu, but you're not allowed to use the makom tur as a means to transfer something from a reshus hayachid to reshus harabim. So too, if you left the key on the threshold, which was a kaimelis, and then you transferred it to the makam tur, which is the lock, you would not be able to transfer it from the lock to a Rosh Hashanah because you'd be violating Rav Dimi's halacha, and you have to put it back where it came from, back into a kaimelis. So those are the three things that we've illustrated from this brisa. Again, how security works, I don't know, but it must be that someone once told me that locks are made for honest people. In other words, anybody can get through a lock, but a lock tells you shouldn't go there, right? The locks of the doors in the shul, everybody knows where you can find the key, but if it's locked, you don't go in because locks are made for honest people. That's the only thing I can think of. Otherwise, the Gemara here just publicized all the passwords. It's called a security breach. This is like when Facebook gets hacked and thousands of passwords get released to the public. That's what just happened here. Nagar sheyesh b'rosh haglustra. They used to use deadbolts. So what they would do is they would drill a hole into the threshold, which was, let's say, wood, and they would put a peg into that hole. Now you can't open the door. So if you had a peg is really not a keli, just an empty peg. But this peg was unique. It had a glustra. It had an orb. It had a ball at the end of it, so it's like a handle. And therefore, you could use it maybe as a pestle, right? You can use it to crush things. It's a shtickle keli. So Rabbi Eliezer holds that you're not allowed to put it into the hole of the threshold on Shabbos to lock it because it looks like binyan. It looks like binyan. Rabbi Yosy holds you're allowed to. Amar Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said, "Ma'aseh b'knesset sheb'Tveria." There was a besmedish in Tveria. So how you know it by heter? They would always use this type of peg to use as their deadbolt. Ad shabar Rabbi Gamliel has a kenim v'asr. Until Rabbi Gamliel has kenim asred it. So Rabbi Eliezer is illustrating from a story that it's also v'asr and asred the thing. Stuttering. Rabbi Yosy said it's exactly the opposite. Is there no hakuboy? They never used to use that bolt on Shabbos. And they said, no, you're allowed to. So you have the story completely backwards. Really, it's mutter. So Tosfos asks a very nice question. Tosfos asks, "V'im Taimar v'amrinim b'nedarim beperek ve'elu nedarim u'beperek makom shenahagu that devarim hamutarim, if there are things that are mutter, v'acherim nahagu b'miser, and a certain group of people decided to be machmir and feared with iser on it, such as this case, these people did not want to use that bolt on Shabbos. You're not allowed to be matter in front of them. So how could the Rebbeinu going to come and say it's mutter if they feared for those usher? Oh, Duvi has that's like hysterics. The Shlomo Zok the Hainu Kishayodim Shemutter, if they know that halachically it's mutter, umachmirin al atzmon. And why would they be machmer even if they know it's mutter? They wanted to be extra machmer so that it wouldn't risk a real isser occurring. Like Duvi said, if the whole reason why they were machmer is because of a mistake, then mutter lahater b'fneim, you're allowed to correct the mistake. I believe that's exactly what Duvi answered. Gewaltig. Zok the Heilige Gemara weiter. Benito be'ogdoi kula amalai pli. Now, we haven't talked about whether or not this bolt is chained to the door or not. So now the Gemara is saying it's for sure chained to the door, but is it chained to the door with a chain that's strong enough that if you lifted the chain, it would suspend this bolt, or would it just break and fall off? So if it's chained to the door with such a strong cable that you can support the bolt with the cable, kula amaloi pligi. Everybody would agree that it's mutter, even Rabbi Eliezer holds it would be mutter, because it's clearly connected to the door, it's part of the door. Hipli, the machlokes, where Rabbi Eliezer asks you to use this bolt, is when the rope that connects it to the door is not very strong, and if you lift it, it will just fall off. The Marasover, Rabbi Yosy holds, even the Yesh Barosha Glustera, since this peg has a ball on it, so it gives it the Shem Keli, Teres Klialov, and independent of it being a bolt, you're allowed to carry it. Well, I shouldn't have said it. It's not a question of books here. Independent of it being a bolt, it looks like it's something prepared for the lock of the door, so therefore it's not called binyan. Since it wouldn't be carried with the rope, meaning it's very flimsily connected to the door, it would be usher, because even if it has a teres kli, it still looks like binyan, and it would be usher to use it on Shabbos. Nagar hanigra. Now we're going back to a bolt that doesn't have a ball on it. It's just a dead bolt. Maybe that's what's called a dead bolt, because there's nothing. It's just a piece of wood that wouldn't have a shem keli at all. And it was hanging off the door with a chain, but it was dragging on the ground. It was dragging on the ground, at least 1 inch. So noel and boy b'mikdash. You're allowed to use that in the base of mikdash. And Rashi tells us, because be'etzem it's not binyan. Elamai, al-tzgzeir, it looks like binyan. So Rashi, the shvus ba'al mutz only with rabbanim. The ain't a boy mamish. It's not binyan. Hoil v'kosher. It's connected to the door. Lakach, for this purpose. Hoil v'nigger, since it drags on the floor, michzig boina. We would ask him rabbanim because people might confuse it with boina. And on that, the ain't shvus derabbanan b'mikdash. There's no derabbanan in the base of mikdash. Like us sham. And we're soon going to see is that it's not absolute. Sometimes you do make a gzeira, and you only don't make a gzeira if it's going to interfere with the functioning of the mishkan. If it's something in the mishkan or the facilities that has nothing to do with what's needed as part of the avodah, there wouldn't be a problem. But I assume in order for the mishkan to function or for the base of mikdash to function, you had to open the doors. So that's why it would be allowed. So Zok Mishtavaiter. Avodah b'Medina. But in a private home, you wouldn't be able to use it. Alfak Zegra. V'hamunach. What if it wasn't even connected with a string? It was a loose bolt. So there, kan v'kan osir, that would be osir because that's a shayla b'daraisa. Because you're actually, it's like binyan when you take just a bolt that's not a keli and you use it to lock your door. If you don't hear, he's more mekel. Hamunach mutar b'mikdash. Even if it's a loose bolt, it's still only with your button. It's not really binyan, and therefore in the base of mikdash will be allowed. V'anigur b'Medina. And although if it's lying on the floor, it would be osir. In the base, it would be also b'Medina, but if it's tied, even though it's dragging on the floor, Rabbi Yehuda would allow us to use that in the Medina. We wouldn't be going. Give me an example of a bolt that drags on the floor that's allowed to be used in the base of mikdash, but not allowed to be used in a private place. If it's hanging, it's tied to the door and it's hanging. And only one end of it, so it's not lying on the floor, one end of it can touch the ground. Rabbi Yehuda says, let's just look at the back. Rabbi Yehuda it doesn't say, Afzeh b'Medina mutter, even that would be mutter b'Medina, because he holds if it's nigrar, it's mutter b'Medina. What is allowed in the base of mikdash and not in Medina? If it's completely not connected at all, you can put it off in the corner when it's not being used. There, it's osher b'Medina, mutter b'mikdash. But if it's even somewhat tied, even b'Medina, you're allowed to do it. So he's makel.
It doesn't answer the kasha. You give me an example of a nagar hanigur. He says it's a nagar hamunach.
I hear it. Omer Rabbi Yehuda, Omer Shmuel, and Rabbi Yehuda, halacha Rabbi Yehuda b'nigrar. So we're makel. We paskin that as long as it's chained to the door, you're allowed to use that bolt on Shabbos. Rashi speaks out, we're only paskining on the kula of what Rabbi Yehuda said by a nagar nigrar. But a loose peg, which Rabbi Yehuda says is allowed in the base of mikdash, that we're not necessarily paskining. But for our purposes, we don't have the base of mikdash. Right now, for our purposes, if you have a bolt that's hanging off the door, you'd be allowed. The only thing I can think of is when you're in a hotel, you always have that bolt that locks the door that has a chain on it. So imagine if that chain was long enough that it dragged on the floor, that's what this would be. Amar the rule is that we say if it's tied to the door, if Yehuda allows it and you're allowed to lock with it, it cannot be chained to the doorpost or to the wall. It actually has to be chained to the door itself. Amy, is that so? Rav Tavla once came to Mechusa. The Chaza lahu davatola be'ivra dedasha. He saw something that was connected to the side. It wasn't connected directly to the door. It was connected to the wall or to the doorpost. And he didn't protest, so it might be good. That was such a heavy chain that you were able to carry it off the chain, and therefore he allowed it even off the doorpost. So now we've just learned a new piece of information that if you have a heavy chain, it doesn't have to be directly connected to the door. It can be connected to the wall or the doorpost. But if it's a light chain that could possibly tear, there it's only considered part of the door if it's connected directly to the door.
What's this for? Why then? You know?
I guess it shows more. It's more obvious that this is part of the lock. If something, the more something could be connected to the door, the more obvious it is that this is not just a loose bolt that I'm adding to my house on Shabbos. Rather, it's part of the functioning lock. So if you have a heavy chain on a bolt, even though it's not on the door, it's on the wall, people will know it's probably for the lock. But if it's not such a heavy chain, then people might think it's just there for convenience. If it's actually connected to the door, again, people will associate it with the door. That's how I understood it. I might be wrong.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of as far of why it would make it any better. Why does it look like more like a lock that's hanging on the door versus hanging on the
Post right
side
near
of
the door. I hear. I don't know. I guess that's how people did things in those days. Yes, the norm was to hang it off the door. Could be it was the norm to hang it off the door.
Bang around every time you open and close the door.
It clanks, yes. So it also acts as like those chimes. It was the early version of chimes.
Maybe you're right.
So Zok the Gemara weiter. Rabbi Abi came to Naidah. Chajal Gavra David Kakotir Begemi. He tied a bolt to the door with a piece of grass, which surely would not last very long. And he told him, Amar, he said, Dain Aloy Nitre. This you cannot use because this is such a lightweight thread, it's not considered connected at all, and you would not be able to lock the door with this on Shabbos. That's right. So sometimes it is good, sometimes it's not good. That's right. Zok the Gemara weiter. How about nikmas? What happens normally? Let's say your threshold that you step on as you walk in the door, let's say it's 3 inch thick. It's a slab of wood that's 3 inches thick. So you drill a hole into the slab 1 inch, and that's what the peg goes into. What if you drilled right through the slab and you have a long peg and it goes right through the slab and it sticks into the ground? So nikmas mahu, would that be allowed as well? Because now it looks more like binyan because you're shoving a stake into the ground as well. So Amar Yosef, why would you ask such a question? Did you not hear this price? Nishmat Usr. If it's disconnected completely, it's going to be Usr to use. Nikmas Mutter. But if it's only that you're sticking into the ground, it would be allowed. We have Yehuda Aimer, Nikmas, Afal Pish, and Nishmat Usr, and the Yehuda holds it's Usr. But Amar Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Allah Rab Yehuda Nikmas. So it's going to be Usr. The time of why should Nikmas be Usr? Amar Abayim, we should the Mechsek Aboina, since this spike is not just going into the wood, but it's going into the ground, it looks more like someone's building. What about Osaloi Beis Yad Mahu? You made a handle on this peg, similar to the last Mishnah, where there was a gluska at the bottom, a gluster at the end of it. So what if you made it into you made a handle on it? So that is a pestle. That's exactly what a pestle is. It's a little peg that has a handle with which you can crush things. And that is a keli that will be mutter. Itmar Amar b'nechumi ba'ada. So clearly, this is going according to the shita of Rabbi Yosy in the last Mishnah, not Rabbi Eliezer. Because Rabbi Eliezer holds, even if it has that ball on it, it's not considered a keli. Itmar Abaye Itmar Amar b'nechumi ba'ada also lebeis yad mutter. It will be mutter. Ha'usha risa to have a beir of pedas. They used to have a big, massive beam that took 10 people to carry, and they had it in Rabbi Pedas's house, and they would use it to block the door as an added security feature. To have a madla be'asar, you needed 10 people to lift it. The shadlu adosha, they would block the door with it, and that was an added security feature. But he didn't stop them from doing that. Why? Amar Taris Kliyala. He said that has a din of a keli because people sit on it. And therefore, you're allowed to move it to the door, and it's not a question of binyan at all, because you're not connecting it to the door. You're just putting it in front of the door. Hayasisa, there was this mortar, which was like a big container in which you crush things. It was huge. Tahabis Beimar Shmuel, Tabamachsekas Adriba. It held a huge amount. So it was something that you couldn't move around that easily. And it's a klisha malach l'isser, because it's made to crush things. Nevertheless, Shoramar Shmuel Mishaji Adosha, he allowed them to take this big heavy bowl and put it in front of the door, again to block the door as an added security feature, because Klisha Malach Lisher is a mutter l'tzara kufa. You need to place it here because you need it to be there to block the door. Amari said, Teres Kliyala, it has a status of a keli, even though it's so big, and it's a Klisha Malach Lisher that you're allowed to use to block the door with. Neimalon Mar Mehalal Milim El Yosa. Rebbe, please tell us from the Zisa Torah, the Amritlan Bishmei Rabasi, that you told us once upon a time in the name of Rabasi, the Chipi de Arba, about those roofs that they make over a boat. Now, anybody who ever watched an old Western movie saw they used to have those wagons, the stagecoach wagons, that had a shmata over it. So they would take arches made out of steel and put it across a wagon, and over those arches they would put a shmata, and that was how they used to travel in the little house on the prairie. So the Gemara says, let's learn a halacha about that. So they used to use those as well to cover boats, to create shade for a boat. So Sholach Lei, he sent it back. Hachi Amar Abasi, how to keep it the arba, these arches that you put over a boat, bisman sheyesh bohen tefach, as long as each arch is a tefach wide, then you're allowed to spread a shmata over it. Because once you have an arch that's a tefach wide, you already have an oil there. By putting a shmata over it, you're merely extending it. Inami ein bohem tefach, or even if the individual arches were not a tefach thick, but between each arch is less than 3 tefachim, so you say love it, so you look at them like they're all connected, then the mocher maybe machzelas, on Shabbos you're allowed to bring a shmata, upoyres alayim, and you're allowed to spread it over the arches. My timer, moisif al oil aray. All you're doing is you already have an oil aray, and you're adding to it, you're allowed to add to an oil aray on Shabbos, b'shaper dami, and that would be allowed. So it's already 5 to 7. Let's stop here. And this is already a whole sugya, because this is the sugya of, are you allowed to open your shlak on Shabbos? Are you allowed to open up an umbrella on Shabbos? So we'll leave it for tomorrow because I want to address it, because there's actually a diak in how you read the Gemara and where you put the comma. Is it my time moisef al oil comma arayu, or is it moisef al oil aray? And depending on where you put the comma, it makes a big nafkamina la'alocha as to whether or not you're allowed to add to an oil. So we'll get to that tomorrow. So we'll leave it for here. Shkoyach.
Shkoyach.
Wonderful day.